The Behemoth Brewing Company presents the Department of Conversation with Pat Brittenden. Behemoth, give me something hoppy.
And it is a delight at the end of 2021 to be welcoming to the Department of Conversation co-leader of the Green Party, James Shaw. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me on the show.
Oh, look, I kind of feel a bit bad on sometimes because I've connected with you guys at the Greens 3 or 4 times, and 3 times I think it's been Marama, and we had Julianne Genter on a different podcast I do for a housing debate not too long ago either. So yeah, it's good to have a chat with one of the boys as well.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think you've got to start with the talent and then just work your way down the list.
Are you still at Parliament right now? I'm just looking at the background behind you. Are you still in
Yes, I am. That window right there is the debating chamber. So I'm a stone throw away, but the House rose last Wednesday, but government keeps going basically right up until Christmas.
So when do you sort of wrap for your year personally? Like when is James Shaw's holiday start?
Friday.
Okay. And how long do you get? When do you go back again in 2022?
I'll be back in the office on Monday the 17th.
Yep.
Yeah. So it's a good stretch. Yeah.
Sir Ian Taylor, do you pay much attention to Sir Ian Taylor? He's obviously a Dunedinite and a pretty well-known man. He's got some opinions recently. He said recently, and I wasn't necessarily going to throw this in there, but just because we talked about holidays, saying that this is probably a pretty bad time for politicians to go off on holidays when the pandemic is arguably at its most dangerous. Does he have a point in any kind of way, shape, or form?
I think he's misinformed. So the way that it works is that both health officials and other people who are involved in the COVID response are on call, or they have rotations through. The same is true of government ministers. There are people who are on duty and they rotate through. And in fact, we do the same thing inside the Green Party. So Marama and I, have periods of time that we're on call in case something significant changes or happens. And of course, with Omicron and who knows what else, it's entirely conceivable. So
basically, you're saying there's a I don't want to use the word skeleton staff because it always makes it sound like there's not enough people there, but there is a pattern or a plan for if people need to be there, they are there.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's certainly the business of government does not stop, and particularly in a time of a pandemic.
I remember last year when Delta all started up, and all of a sudden there was a press conference called for like 9:30 p.m. It might have even been the 9:30 p.m. press conference before the first lockdown, and then of course Countdown was all locked up with people buying and all that sort of stuff. And I thought, oh my goodness! So obviously that was a matter of urgency, which required we're not waiting till tomorrow morning. This is a bit of a crystal ball silly question because I'm not asking you to confirm anything, but with this current COVID thing we're going through, is there even anything that's possible that could happen that would require like some kind of announcement on Christmas Day? Like, could there be any, like, for example, if Omicron got into the community on Christmas Day, is it possible that could happen? Could something happen significant enough to require a Christmas Day announcement? Or would it always, are we in a situation now where kind of the next day or the day after is always fine?
Well, look, I think the thing about predictions is that they invariably turn out to be wrong. But if living through a global pandemic for the last 2 years has taught us anything, it's that anything can happen at any moment, we just need to be aware of that. I think what's qualitatively different between now and when the Delta outbreak first happened was that we're now at 90% vaccinations around the country, and we were not at that number back then. And so, the way that Jacinda's described it in the past is that we have kind of had a moat around the country. The elimination strategy was built on the idea of not letting the virus into the country. Yeah. And the strategy now is that everyone has their own individual suit of armor, if you like. And obviously you try and minimize that by ensuring to the extent that you can that it doesn't get into the country. But the vaccination strategy is critically important to that. The variable, of course, is strains of the virus that may be resistant to some of the vaccines, or are less effective, or have kind of, they just interact differently, because those vaccines are quite highly tailored to the virus. So that the booster program that's starting to roll out, all of that's, I think, critically important and will make a difference, because I don't think that there would be much of an appetite for further lockdowns. But having said that, there are countries that are going through lockdowns again, which are vaccinated countries.
Yeah, I just saw, actually, and not even necessarily a lockdown, but I've just seen, of course, one of our favorite people from Fox News putting out information about, oh my goodness, the world's coming to an end. Saturday Night Live has just cancelled their live audiences. So obviously some places are going backwards and putting more restrictions on as well. And I think I was speaking to a couple of people in Auckland, my sister being one of them, over the last couple of days. And I think those of us outside of Auckland don't really get a gist of what people have been going through inside of Auckland. They've been locked down for 4 months. I was talking to my sister today, and I kind of said it feels like the rest of New Zealand to Auckland is kind of like all of New Zealand to the rest of the world last year. Like last year, when we were all running around having, All Black Test matches and cricket matches and stuff, and then we'd see masks coming out of New York or London or whatever, we were like, oh, that's right, there's that thing going on. And I think the rest of the country is in that state of mind a little bit, although it is different with masks and stuff for the rest of us as well. But compared to what Auckland's been through, and I think the point that someone made to me was coming up to Christmas is going to be an interesting time as well, because people want to have a break or a holiday, like almost from reality. Yet, like the hospo industry, a lot of the hospo people are being asked to stay, like not take a holiday, because obviously these bars and restaurants and cafes that have been shut for so long, they're like, we need to make money now, so please don't take any holidays. And I didn't think about that. So this kind of goes on various levels for other people, especially those who are put in the position to kind of serve us when it comes to things like food and hospitality.
Yeah, I think your sister's probably right. I think one of the weaknesses of the human condition is that we tend to generalize from our own personal experience, right? And we say, well, things must be fine because I'm fine, and that is clearly, obviously not true. And so, I really feel for people who have been in Auckland and have had to, for a very, very long time maintain that. We've obviously had a number of our MPs in that, and you can see the effect it's had kind of firsthand on them and their work. I've actually even got a staff person who's an Australian who was at home in Melbourne when Melbourne went into lockdown at the beginning of the year, and I think from memory was in lockdown for 10 months. Before they got let out. So, and it's hard, right? It really is hard. So you can absolutely see why people are kind of, deserve a break, which is one of the reasons I think Ian Taylor's wrong.
Off the mark a bit, you think? Just to let people know as well, we are live at the moment. So if you've got questions or comments, feel free to fire them through whatever platform you're watching us on. And if they're appropriate or, let's be honest, any good, maybe we'll throw them into the conversation as well. I like what you said about people's personal experiences, because I hear quite often people talking about, my existence, or don't deny my existence, or don't deny my realities. And I have to be very gentle sometimes and say, that's what we think of as anecdotal evidence. Like what you're experiencing may not be accurate to the data set of the broader picture. So I think that you're completely right. It's something that needs to be you need to be aware of with this, which is why I think it's good to get a wake up call every now and again, like I did in the last couple of days, speaking to people from Auckland and finding out what it's like, what it's like for them. So I don't know, and I think it's probably too early to tell Omicron what's going to happen, but hopefully some of the stuff out of South Africa, and I saw some news articles out of the UK with a number of people going to hospital. Hopefully that it looks like it's more contagious but less dangerous, and it may burn itself out, which I think is what people said happened to bird flu in the end. Might be our path out. Might be. I'm not a doctor, don't want to say anything that means it, but that's what I'm sort of reading.
I have read that, and then I've read articles that say the opposite. So I think on this one I'm just going to wait until Ashley makes a call on it.
Do you have to be really careful in the position you've got in Parliament about offering personal opinions that then end up being a headline?
Yeah, hugely. I mean, I sometimes think, when people ask me about, what do I think is going on? It's like, well, do you really need me to add my reckons? Are there not enough reckons out there already? But we do have a leadership role to play, and so for us in the Greens, and our kind of view really strongly is that we need to rely on the best science and the best that government can do, and we have to take our role very seriously to make sure that when we're communicating, what we're doing is we're amplifying the public health response first and foremost. And so, making sure that we're operating off the best information that comes to us from the health authorities and from the science community on this is a line that we've taken. Sometimes that may mean that what we say sounds boring and not newsworthy, and that's a trade-off I'm more than willing to make, because the last thing that we need is more misinformation and disinformation out there from people who are just trying to get a headline.
I might butcher this, but I'm paraphrasing. I heard someone once talk about science as the best worst solution, the best current worst solution we have. And then tomorrow, hopefully, it'll be a better. In other words, we don't know everything yet, but it's the best of what we don't know everything of to get us to where we're at today, sort of thing. I probably have butchered that. Has it ever happened to you, that whole kind of personal opinion that got blown up? Was it something you had to learn, or was it in the day one MP's handbook and you've never been there?
There's no such thing as the day one MP's handbook. There's no one who shows up here ready to go. There are some people who, kind of adapt faster than others, and some who never quite adapt. What people have done in their previous lives doesn't necessarily translate to success or failure in this context. It's a really weird place. And undoubtedly, I'm going to say, yes, there are definitely things that I have said which were personal opinions that blow up into something more than I had intended or anticipated. Yes, I have learned from them. Can I remember what they are? No, but I'm pretty sure they happened.
Hey, because we're live today, and this is actually something I wouldn't mind the answer to as well. But we've got someone watching, got Jason watching, who says, "Can James explain 3 waters to me like I'm 10?" I think that's an interesting question, because I understand what the 3 waters are, the 3 different kinds of waters, but what is all the hubbub around it at the moment, and where do the Greens sit on the idea of the 3 waters legislation?
Well, basically, you remember 3 or 4 years ago, there was that horrendous outbreak in Havelock North, where a whole bunch of people, thousands of people, got really, really crook, and a few people died. There was, people looked into what the cause of that was, and essentially found that our kind of pipes essentially are in pretty terrible shape in most parts of the country, and fixing that is a multi-billion-dollar problem. And so what we've got is every council, we've got about 60 councils around the country who are delivering water services in one way or another. So you get a lot of duplication of effort, and you don't get any economies of scale. And so the 3 Waters project is essentially the idea that you want to be able to create scale and get some efficiencies into the system to be able to upgrade about a 30-year backlog of infrastructure. Now, that's not evenly distributed. There are some councils that are in fine shape. There are others that are in terrible shape. And that's where you get a little bit of the heat around this, is that there are some councils that are saying, "Oh, well, we're doing a fine job. Why should we be a part of this?" But that's the basic idea behind it. And where do the Greens sit on it? Well, we're certainly very clear that the status quo does not work. The evidence is absolutely overwhelming that we've got to change it. We do have some skepticisms around some parts of the program, but broadly, we're just kind of saying, as long as we maintain those kind of local decision making, and that we don't allow these things to eventually be in a position to get sold off to private interests or anything like that, we'll be kind of broadly supportive of the overall direction.
So as you explain it, and obviously you'll appreciate with a grain of salt, I'm speaking to a politician here who's given me a perspective. And I'll be honest with you, I'm not too well read on the Three Waters, and I wasn't planning on having a massive political conversation with you today. It's more end of the year. Let's have a catch up, and thanks for coming on and doing that. But the way you described it sounds completely sensible. It sounds like what we're saying is we don't want to turn into Flint, Michigan. So we get, and they might have been 100 years out of date. We're 30 years out of date, so we want to get ahead of it. So are you able to put on what the other team are saying, what the complainants are saying is? Because what I was hearing is, and reading on Twitter, that place that Dave Chappelle describes as not real life, which I love, but about privatization and selling and not owning our waters anymore. And where are the complaints coming from? Because the way you describe it, that sounds completely reasonable.
Yeah. Well, I try to be reasonable on principle. Look, I think so. There are genuinely held concerns about public assets that have been built up with public money through rates, which are owned by councils, getting aggregated up into a sort of a corporate model. Even if it's still owned by the councils, which they will be, that'll become somehow even more remote from people than the current system. And I think in different parts of the country, that view is held differently. So I'm from Wellington, where, frankly, I think the vast majority of Wellingtonians would be quite keen for some organisation to come along and sort it out, because we have on an ongoing basis, pipes exploding, stormwater on the streets, sewage ruptures, it's pretty horrendous. But I know that in other parts of the country, people take a very different view. So I think there's a sort of a sense of democratic ownership, which people are worried about losing that. I do think that some people conflate the idea of the model that's being proposed with privatization, because they think that those big entities are then going to be sold off, which there's absolutely no intention of doing. And in fact, the minister who's responsible for the program, the Naya Mahuta, is trying to build in even more safeguards than the current system has, because actually, our government could decide to privatize water like that. It could just introduce legislation that overrides the bit of the act that says that those things can't be privatized. You can just change that if you wanted to. So she's looking at additional safeguards to make sure that they can't be privatized. But I can understand some of those concerns that people have, and you can argue the toss about the extent to which government's communicated effectively, and you can also argue the toss about the amount of misinformation and disinformation that's been deliberately put out by certain organisations that are opposed to the government.
As it sounds, a part of it is also, correct me if I'm wrong, that like the people in section part A of the country whose pipes are fine don't want to pay for the people in section F. It feels a little bit like, why am I paying for the bloody roads in Auckland? That conversation that would have gone. Is that a part of it as well?
Yeah, there is a bit of that. So the principle here is that if you've got these kind of four, like part of creating scale is that those kind of big four entities are built around, largely, not entirely, but largely built around kind of main centres, right? So, you'll have kind of Auckland and Northland in kind of one, sort of Wellington's the main centre for the one that kind of stretches up the east coast of the North Island. Christchurch and Dunedin are the main centres for the South Island, and the entities that cover that will be responsible for ensuring that people everywhere in their area get the services of fresh drinkable water on an ongoing basis, that the sewerage is looked after, and that stormwater is well maintained. And so you can anticipate a situation where there's effectively cross-subsidization. But the point is, those entities have to ensure that everybody, whether you live in the city or in the country, is getting the same level of service when it comes to water.
Yeah, and it's also, I think it was Rand Paul in America just in the last few days someone who's voted against all the stimulus packages and help for, various disasters all over the world, has voted against them. And then as soon as there's a disaster in his area, he's like, well, government, we need money for it. So even if we are, if that is a part of it, like why are we paying for the roads in Auckland type thing, or why are we paying for the water pipes in Wellington? There's always going to be a time where, someone's going to need help in their area that is being funded by other people. It's what happens. I was interested, you were talking about Nanaia Mahuta there, talking about writing into the legislation, making changes basically so the water couldn't be privatized. As someone who is a kind of natural partner of the Labour Party, has been in the past before, do you think the Labour Party is missing any opportunities at the moment because of this majority they've got? Like, I remember before the last election going, if Labour gets in, they have a majority, they can do whatever the hell they want. It seems that the Prime Minister made a bit of a promise to be more moderate and has kind of stuck by that. Whether that's because of COVID, there's reasons for it. In your opinion, or even from a policy point of view, are they missing the mark on anything, or are they missing any opportunities not utilising this majority they've got?
Well, I think that the Prime Minister is one of the most responsible people, or has one of the strongest senses of responsibility of any human I've ever met in my life. And I know that she takes the views of the people who voted for her and the views of people who didn't very seriously. So I think she has a sense of responsibility to govern on behalf of everybody, like the full spectrum, and recognising that there were people who voted Labour at the last election who have never voted Labour before and may never vote Labour again. She still has a sense of responsibility to govern through their lens, as well as, the kind of more traditional voter base, if you like. So my view, the Green Party's view is, there are things I think that they could do go further on. And, we've talked about, housing inequality, response to climate change as all as areas where we think that they've got an opportunity to make even more of a difference than they currently do. At the same time, I can understand, why there's a level of restraint in the views that they take.
So you kind of led into my next question already, which was, no one's got a crystal ball and can tell this for real, but it would, I think, be a pretty fair bet to say that there won't be another majority of the next election. I think that's a pretty fair assumption, although it is an assumption. And if Labour were to get in again, it would be probably as Greens as their partner. Those things are all pretty fair. Is there anything you've seen or anything you know of that you would want to be a bit of a handbrake on what Labour is doing, or anything that they're doing that you'd want to add fuel to or push harder on, as a part of an agreement between them to say, well, actually, if we're going to help you be government, we want to see more of this, or we want to see less of this. Has anything come up in this term that's made you kind of think that's where we would like to see the next term go?
Yeah, I think generally we are pushing them to go further and faster rather than to slow down or stop doing things. I think we've had there's been one campaign that we've run recently, which is around mining in conservation land, which was in the speech from the throne in 2017, and there's still mining licenses operating or being permitted on conservation land, and so we've said that's an area where we'd like you to stop, please. And pretty much everything else we're saying actually must go faster, and that the scale of the crises that we face, whether it is climate change or the housing crisis or the kind of growing inequality, partially fueled by the pandemic and the economic response to pandemic, but all of those underlying conditions were certainly there well before the pandemic came along. Those are all things where we're saying, actually, if you were to be kind of bolder and more decisive and take some kind of bigger calls, if you like, then we think that the results will speak for themselves. And even those people who may be sceptical or outright opposed to Labour, I think would say, well, actually, you might have different ideas about them, but they're delivering, and they're fixing some of those big long-term challenges. And generally, national-led governments are innately conservative, so their agendas are smaller, by design and philosophically. And so what that means is that they tend to store up problems rather than resolve problems. And so, I guess we should take the opportunity while we can of trying to resolve those issues, because they're more likely to go into stasis under a national-led government.
But that's kind of what I'm saying. Taking those opportunities, they've got the opportunity to do whatever they want right now, literally whatever they want right now, because they've got a majority. We just think it was an appropriate time to bring up some Green Party social media, because you guys are on point. Your social media is fire compared to the rest of the political parties. For people who aren't watching, I've just brought up one of the last Instagram posts, which is looks like Kermit. Maybe we can't say it's Kermit, Kermit-like, because that might have copyrighted on it. And it looks like this is a sad, depressed frog saying, how would you feel if someone was mining under your home? Because that's what Ocean Gold is planning to do to our critically endangered. Is it Archie's frog? Is that how it's called?
Archie's frog. That's right.
Archie's frog. Tell Labor to stop them from mining our conservation land. Sign our open letter now. Link in bio. So I mean, what you just said at the end there about, that's what I'm saying. It's like, this is the time that, should Labor want to do anything transformational, is that the right word? To transform the country and what they think is best, this will be the time to do it, because it's highly unlikely that they will get a majority next time around. I mean, they might, but it's highly unlikely. There's even a chance that it won't be a Labor-led government,
Well, there is always that chance, right? And again, just as COVID produced an ahistorical result last time, it could produce a very unusual result next time as well. You just don't know. I guess the pitch that we in the Greens are making is that if you want to see that bold action and you really want to see what government can do to transform those really stuck crises that have been building up, for a long time, then having our votes be required to be able to form a government and to be able to use a bit of that leverage, I think we would say vote for us.
That's a bit early to be throwing that out there, isn't it? Your party policy already?
Yeah, well, you never stop making your pitch.
It's interesting, isn't it?
You've got to demonstrate the value that you bring, I find. That's what
I think I remember one, it might have even been Winston, but then again, you kind of out both sides of his mouth, talking about, is it a job interview, lining up. Oh, no, you know what? It was Don Brash, because I asked him once about it when I interviewed him, talking about like lining up. It's an appointment. An election is a job interview, and queuing up for a job like other people do job interviews. So you got to put, you got to put your best CV forward, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the only job interview where you've got 5 million people interviewing you at once, but yeah.
The point at the time I made to Don Brash was, because he had said it's like a job interview, so it was his quote, and he had just been interviewed recently by Duncan Garner, where Duncan Garner asked him the same question 6 times in a row, and he refused to answer it. So I said to Don Brash, and I would say this to any politician, like if you did it, I'd say it to you next time around. If this is a job interview, how can you sit in a job interview with someone and refuse to answer the question of the person looking to employ you? And as is his fashion, he will say that's a very fair question, and I guess that's for the voters to decide. So anyway.
So he didn't answer that question either.
No, he didn't really answer that question, because what can you say? Hey, the biggest question of the day, and I probably should have started with this, because this is the one everyone's waiting for, is Jacinda's wedding. Do you have an invite?
I wouldn't expect one.
Really?
No.
Is it going to be a small affair, do you think?
I've no idea, but that's really her business. I didn't invite her to my wedding either.
It's an interesting thing, because workmates, where is the line between workmates and stuff? Will like the Greens send the Prime Minister a wedding present, like as an acknowledgement, or is it like personal, is completely personal and you just stay away from it?
To tell you the truth, we haven't been focusing on it, so
really?
I don't know.
Everyone was focusing on Jacinda's wedding. Well, that was the biggest news story of the day.
Yeah, no, I mean, those of us who know Jacinda in a personal capacity, of course we will. But I sort of see that as very much in the. I mean, when you're the Prime Minister, you're far more public property than you are as a government minister or any other kind of politician. I get that, but I think, a wedding is such a personal, intimate, important, special moment in your life. The last thing that I would want is workplace representation, from colleagues. Having said that, there would be people from my workplace who I would consider friends, who I would want there, so I've no doubt, there will be people from her working life who are there. But I would anticipate that they would be, the people who are kind of nearest and dearest, old friends.
Who are your best mates in Parliament? Who are your friends, and then what about some of the people from the sort of opposing view, even if they're not your best mates? Who are the people that if you're across the road at the pub, you can sit and have a beer with, maybe not talk politics, but just hang out with?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what, during the last term of government, I got to know Todd Muller really well. Because he was the National Party's spokesperson on climate change. And so he led the kind of negotiations with the government, because you remember we were making this, we were doing the Zero Carbon Act, and we wanted, to the extent that we could, we wanted it to be a bipartisan piece of legislation, because we wanted it to last longer than our government.
Right.
And when it comes to climate change, this is a 3-decade response. You've got to have consistency. And New Zealand hasn't had consistency, so we thought that was critical. And so we spent a lot of time with Todd, and I really got to respect him a lot. And I, was deeply saddened for him personally when he had a mental health crisis in the middle of an election campaign. And again, the tragedy or the sense of tragedy when Judith Collins kind of dropped him from the pack and everything. And so I thought, there's some kind of bad things happen to good people sometimes. And so I do catch up with him socially, and actually we don't just talk about work. And that's really nice. It's not because Todd and I politically are quite different characters, right? We come from quite different political traditions. We've got quite different ideas about where the country should go. But I've always considered him to be someone with real integrity, who actually is quite a good guy to hang out and have a beer with and talk about life, the universe, and everything.
It's interesting you would say that. I just watched a documentary on Netflix called The Malice at the Palace, and it's about a fight that happened in an NBA basketball game between I think it was the Pistons and the Indiana Pacers, and they were interviewing all the players. It was like in 1996 or 98 or something like that, and they were interviewing all the players, and one of the comments that the players made was, what the fans don't realize is we're all friends, like even on opposing teams.
Yeah.
So in other words, the fans got involved in this fight, but probably if no one had of, after the thing, they would have gone, oh, that was a dick move, given him a punch in the arm and, gone for a beer sort of thing. And as you're talking, I'm kind of thinking the same about sort of, and, yes, there is division in every country. We probably see it more in America than anywhere else, but that you guys sitting in Parliament and kind of making the rules and pushing through the legislation are probably a lot closer, friendlier, whatever a level below friendlier is, than perhaps the Green supporter and the National supporter. And it's ironic to me, and I'm just thinking out loud as I'm talking, you can probably hear because the words aren't quite coming, that the supporters of the political parties who don't know each other, who don't see each other all the time, who only get contact through Twitter or Facebook or whatever, are the ones who are divided, whereas perhaps the ministers and the parliamentarians aren't, which is kind of a weird thought.
Yeah. Well, I'd never really. I mean, that's entirely possible. I think there are, plenty of people I would choose not to hang out with here. But actually, I'll tell you, probably the exception to that, which always surprised me, is that the youth wings of the parties actually seem to get on quite well, which is unusual, because generally the youth wings are kind of for all of the parties, way more kind of, strident and kind of black and white in their views than the political wings are. But the youth wings have collaborated a lot on things like marriage equality, for example, or drug law reform and kind of other social issues. And actually, when the youth wings of the Greens, Labor, ACT, National all line up and say, "Hey, we all agree, our parliamentarians should be doing the following," it actually carries some weight, because the youth of the country are obviously a pretty important constituency, and anything that we do now is going to affect them more than it affects older people, and so it is worth listening to. But it always surprised me how well they work together on some issues, given how intense they can be.
I remember marriage equality being one of those ones in particular, and I remember seeing a meeting with a bunch of young libertarians speaking to, on the panel, all the older libertarians, and obviously all the older libertarians who had been through the 80s when there was a Homosexuality Law Reform Act and there was illegal, and it was considered different to those people, had that bias built into them, whereas the young people were like, but we're libertarians, freedom to do whatever you want, that's what we are. And the older ones were like, well, no to same-sex marriage. It was a really interesting dynamic, and I wonder if we see changes in policy through attrition, or we see it, I guess, as you're hinting at, that if you're smart enough to see what the younger people are saying. Like, I often think about the founding fathers. We hear about America, the founding fathers, so many of them were under 30, but we don't hear that conversation. Whereas now you look at people who are under 30 and they get taken like less seriously. And I'm like, but if you look at the people who started worlds, who discovered play, they were all young. They weren't 60. I mean, some of the founding fathers were, but so many of them were also like under 30, under 35. I remember being working in schools, and there was two kinds of teachers we came across. One was the kind of teacher that thought, this beginning teacher is young, they know nothing, stay out of my way. And the other one that thought, this beginning teacher has just left university, maybe they've got some new initiatives or new ways to do things that we can actually learn from. And I was always really impressed with the people who would see a younger person, a 21-year-old teacher, as a resource rather than a thing to have to put up with.
Yeah, well, I mean, frankly, I think that's probably any workplace. You would see that, or those attitudes. I got to tell you, I think that there's been a material shift in the last few years. Like, there was a time when people under the age of 30 were just almost completely locked out of the political process, right? So there were virtually no parliamentarians of under 30 years old. There were certainly no city councillors under that. And over the last few years, in fact, I mean, the last local body elections, there were kind of 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds elected all over the country, including in places where you really wouldn't expect it. And I think part of that was actually off the back of the school strikes movement. We had something like in 2019, we had about 175,000 people marching for climate change up and down the country. And my sense is that the local body election after that, your regular local body voters, and it's a very low turnout around the country, it's only about 40%, and they generally skew quite a lot older, and they tend to be property owners, and local authorities have tended to reflect that in their policies. Where I think they kind of went, well, actually, maybe we could do with some younger people around the table, and so there's been a real shift there in younger people getting taken seriously, and actually, I think where the prevailing wisdom would once have been, you should have a career and then go on to politics because you don't really know anything, blah, blah, blah. Where actually the experience of being a young person and the challenges that you face as a young person in a representative democracy are worth having representatives for, people who actually can have, can speak from their experience and from the communities that they know, and the kind of standout amongst all that is, of course, Chloe Swarbrick, was a bit of an icebreaker. She wasn't the first, but I think she's the first of this kind of wave that's happening now.
The wave is interesting. The wave is interesting because I think about I was involved with some youth work and working with young people as I came through my 20s. And whilst I wasn't there at the start, probably in my early 20s, I came on board. There was a group out in East Auckland that was running a bunch of kind of youth groupy type things. And it was started by 16, 17, 18-year-olds, like before I got there. They started it. But the thing is, by the time they were, and I was their age, but I just came on board later, by the time they were 25, 26, 27, they were still running it.
Yeah.
And actually they had to leave to have the next people either take it over or it fail. Like one of the two things were going to happen. So when you say there's been a change, I think back to that, and I think back to there needs to be either space made.
Yeah.
Or there needs to be space made, space taken, or again, perhaps attrition, let's not say through death, but attrition for the young people to step up into that situation. And I wonder what it is now. I wonder if it's space made, or I wonder if the young people are just pushing their ways in.
Well, personally, I think there's a bit of both, right? Clearly young people are pushing. They're kind of saying, hey, we're pretty fed up. We're pretty fed up when it comes to housing. We're really worried about climate, and we want and we want change. And actually, I think that voice has gotten sufficiently loud enough and persistent enough that older generations are kind of going, actually, you know what? Okay, we're just going to take one step back and allow a bit of space there, which hasn't happened before. So yeah, I think it is a bit of both. It certainly wouldn't happen without the pushing, though. There wouldn't be any space to be given if it wasn't for the push.
Yeah, I guess because it's also easier to make space. I mean, if you think about a group of people, someone pushing their way in, like, and if they don't let you in, you can make your own space. So it can kind of work both ways as well.
Yeah.
Hey, I wanted to ask you a question. It's kind of really the only kind of politically, potentially difficult question to ask you, and it's not about New Zealand at all. Actually, it's about Taiwan. And the reason I want to ask you this question was I was just watching. I'll bring up a poll. I watch an online news source called Breaking Points. It's based on YouTube. People can watch it. They've got about 700,000 subscribers, and it's a really interesting show because they have two very good hosts, one being left wing, one being right wing, and they're both very good, and they're both very reasonable, and they're both very consistent. They did a poll the other day that said, if China were to invade Taiwan, would you support the United States coming to Taiwan's defense? 57% of responders, and there's 100,000, I think, odd people, 127,000, said that they would. Now, the interesting thing about that in the kind of commentary universe, ecosystem, is people were really surprised that in this new media, like it's beyond new media, we're now into new media source, that there's still this vibe of what the old media respondents were. So the watchers of television and readers of newspapers were the people who are okay with America going to war, primarily Americans that have answered this. But even in new media, it hasn't changed. And I guess I clicked unsure there because I kind of am unsure, but also because I wanted to see the results. And I was intrigued with a couple of things. It made me think about Taiwan and how at the moment Taiwan seems to be one of those subjects amongst politicians around the world that they're not allowed to say, should Taiwan be a country or not? And I wanted to ask you that, and I genuinely don't know what the protocol is for this, so apologies if I go in the wrong direction, but if you're allowed to answer that question or not, and if you do, what is your answer? And if you answer yes, is that going to cause some kind of unintended headline like we talked about before? But also the kind of idea about what we should do in these sorts of situations to support what appears to me being just a dickhead from Dunedin who can say the country of Taiwan being oppressed by China, what we should do about it.
Well, I think you may have answered some of your questions leading into that. I mean, so there's, I think actually you've just done quite a good job of unpacking why it is such a complex issue, right? So New Zealand recognises China, the government of China, and we essentially kind of participate in the broad although not universal, but the broad global consensus, which is that it's the government of China that's recognized, and the quid pro quo for that is that China won't invade Taiwan to kind of reintegrate it, so to speak, with the mainland. And so that's been our kind of diplomatic stance for a very long time. And I guess the issue at the moment is that the government of China appears to be kind of saber rattling and kind of pushing things further than anybody's really comfortable with, and making noises that actually a peaceful resolution is not necessarily the highest priority. Now, the Green Party, on the other hand, always takes the stance of non-violence and try to work through dispute resolution. And the extent to which we think that New Zealand should play any kind of role in that at all would always be as essentially in a kind of a mediating kind of role, a sort of a peacemaking role to the extent that we can, or that people want us to. What happens with China obviously affects us, enormously, given our trading relationship with China and also with Taiwan, but also the impact it would have on the Asia Pacific region, and to other countries that we're very close to. It would be a horrendous outcome for us as a country for there to be a war, and so anything that we can do to avoid that, I think, is we need to bend our minds to.
Anything we can do. So, and this question was based around obviously the US going to Taiwan's defense, and the irony that the commentators have been saying about this show was they're expecting the respondents to this program to be like, no, of course there shouldn't be war, kind of what you're saying, but they're still saying, because the point that some commentators were making was, if America went to war with China, that would be World War III, and nothing's kind of worth that. What about the question of what is Taiwan? What are they? How should we be considering them? Should we consider them, a part of China, separate from China, their own country? What do you say to that?
Well, we would say that everybody on Earth has the right to self-determination. So that's not really a question for me. It's really for the people of Taiwan to determine for themselves. I mean, I'm not kind of remotely qualified to put words into their mouths. So that would be the stance that we would take.
So look, honestly, and I'm not trying to be a cheeky bastard here, but does that mean you can't really answer the question? Like you can't actually say they should be a country because of our relationship with China?
Well, I have responsibilities as a government minister. I have to kind of represent the views of the government, and especially when it comes to matters of foreign relations, right? So, there's that. But I guess my point is, I don't, putting my ministerial hat to one side for a second, I don't consider it, my, I don't think that I should take a view about whether Taiwan should or should not be a country. That's not for me to say, right? My point is that, certainly in the Green Party's view, that people, should have a right to determine for themselves, what kind of governance arrangements they want for themselves. I mean, that's kind of what we would call appropriate decision making in our parlance. That the people who are affected by a decision should participate in those decisions that affect them. And so, you can extend that principle out in that way. And then, second of all, which is another of our principles, is the principle of non-violence, that we should always seek to resolve matters non-violently before we resolve them violently.
So what I hear you saying, correct me if I'm wrong, is if the people of Taiwan overwhelmingly wanted to be a country, we should, as a country, as a government, as the Greens, support them wanting to be a country?
Look, I think the Green Party would take the view that it is up for the people of Taiwan to determine that. Yeah, the question of consequences obviously needs to get worked through, and that's why Taiwan's never sort of had a referendum on that, because they know that the consequences of that would be severe, and so we've got a situation now where Taiwan operates, to all intents and purposes, as a independent nation. It's just not necessarily recognised as such diplomatically.
It's fascinating. I find that fascinating. But look, we'll move on from that because I'm interested before we head off. I actually wanted to get to one quick thing. I'm just looking at our times to make sure we don't hold you up for too long. In fact, I won't ask you about that. I was going to ask you about where do you draw the line for that kind of violent response? Because I think I agree with you that obviously the non-violent response is always the best, but where do you then stop it? At what point? And I was thinking about the people in America who voted no to that poll. Where would they say when is the time to get involved in something? Like if country X, and let's not mention any big C word country, but country X invaded Canada, would that be the time to get involved because it's on your landmass or whatever? And I think that's another conversation for another day, I guess. But that was an interesting thing. Because where I'd actually like to finish off with you today, if you've got a couple more minutes, is what you guys put out. I think it actually came out today. And you're looking forward to 2022. Have you seen the new South Park movies yet? There's the series of movies coming out.
No, I somehow managed to miss those.
You gotta stay up to play with what's going on. South Park have just started a series.
I've been very busy watching Hawkeye recently, so.
Any good? I haven't picked up on that yet. Is it?
Right.
Is it
yeah, it's terrific. Yeah.
No, South Park have just started a series of 14 movie-length episodes on Paramount Plus. And one of the jokes they make at the start is they go, it's the end of COVID. COVID's finally over. And then as they pan back and pull out, you realize it's 40 years later. So the joke they make is this goes on and on and on and on and on. So we're not going to go down that path because the Greens have 7 reasons to look forward to 2022. Now, conversion therapy, that's getting banned next year, or it has been banned. So we're looking forward to 2022.
The legislation is about to pass, so it's not quite through every stage yet, but it is going to happen. So that's great. That's
one of those ones that seems like an absolute no-brainer to me. Eh?
Yeah.
You look at the stats around that and the suicides that come with it, and people who fight to keep that. I'm just like, it's a little bit like sometimes. And look, I don't want to get into debate with anybody about this. You can sometimes kind of understand the arguments that people make around abortions. You can kind of go, well, okay, I may disagree with you, but I can see you're talking, there's some sort of thing you're talking about. But things like same-sex marriage and conversion therapy and these things where you're talking about autonomous individuals as adults, and I just don't get it. I don't get how anyone could be against that one.
Yeah, so. and the world is, clearly, or certainly, New Zealand attitudes are kind of have moved on. So it sort of felt like it was resisted and resisted and resisted and resisted and resisted and resisted, and then all of a sudden it just happened, right? Like we got to this kind of tipping point, and actually I think every party in Parliament is supporting it now, which is great.
Hey, look, let me ask you something. Actually, just speaking about that, because I was really surprised, not a commentary from me on good versus bad, that the births, deaths, marriages certificate bill that went through, whatever that was, the BD, whatever it is, that went through, was unanimous.
Yes, I was conflating the two because conversion therapy is a conscience bill, I think. But no, the birth, deaths, marriages registration bill did go through unanimously, and we were delighted about that.
Well, the reason I was surprised with that, as I say, not a commentary on whether it should or shouldn't have been, was whatever gets passed unanimously when it's about issues like, I guess gender and sex and sexuality and that kind of stuff. It seems that there are always one or two people who disagree. It was really surprising that it was unanimous. How did you guys react to that?
Oh, we were delighted. We're delighted because the signal that it sends is so strong. When we're talking about, a section of our community that has been systematically discriminated against kind of forever, and who, when you look at the statistics, have kind of terrible outcomes in terms of incomes and health and, kind of anything really, any measures, actually being acknowledged to be able to say, actually, you have the right to self-determination on that matter. I think it was a very, very strong signal. And so, we were delighted that it was unanimous.
I have one question around that, and I wasn't going to talk to you about this, but this is my one question, and I'm just trying to find the actual quote. Give me 10 seconds. All right, gender in there. Here we go. Anyway, we're going to do a debate on this. We've got some people who are going to have a conversation around it, because what it seems that that law, that bill has done, has now made the ability to self-identify sex be legal. Whereas up until that went through, I think the country as a whole, maybe the world as a whole, understood about people self-identifying gender, but there's no gender. And even I was going to bring it up, one of your politicians who spoke out on it the next day talked about, and I didn't find the quote, but it talks about they have the right now to self-identify their gender on their birth certificate. Gender's not on a birth certificate. Sex is on a birth certificate. So what the government has done in that has changed the conversation from the previous 20 years, because it kind of used to be gender and sex was the same thing. And then we sort of decided that gender was a social construct and sex was biological. And then we kind of decided that sex was biological and gender was self-identifiable. And then at that point of the legislation, we've gone back to being gender and sex is the same thing again. And that's confusing to me, only because it's not gender. People keep talking about you can self-identify gender on the birth certificate. Gender's not on the birth certificate. It's self-identifying sex, which up until that day was the biological. Like I always used to think about sex being sex being the hardware and gender being the software. You know, that sort of boy computer type term. But that changed it on that day, in that moment. That was another reason I was surprised it passed unanimously, because no one else seemed to pick up on the fact that you weren't voting on gender, even though everyone was talking about gender.
Yeah, well, so I had some interaction with this in the last term when I was Minister of Statistics, because one of the issues that we were facing with the government was essentially around gender and sex identification codes. You know, for official statistics purposes. And you know, you had some parts of government that find it very difficult to manage a situation where people can self-identify, because they kind of need, you know, drop-down menus and so on and so forth in order to sort of manage their data. But one of the things that we discovered, which is perhaps unsurprising, is that there's no shared language within government and between government agencies, and so we were using those terms themselves interchangeably across different parts of government. And so, you know, I think you probably described it best yourself. There's sort of a journey that we're going on here in terms of our understanding, and our language hasn't wholly caught up with that. And in fact, the understanding itself is unevenly distributed. And so, you know, that's kind of not wholly surprising. I think what's significant about the birth-test marriages bill was that I think it probably helps to shift the whole conversation forward and our understanding forward sort of everywhere. You know, so I think, you know, in addition to providing some kind of hope and some recognition for people who are non-binary and want to be able to self-identify, that they have that option, it actually helps kind of more broadly to advance our overall understanding about matters like sex and gender and biology that often get conflated.
Yeah, you said in that sentence what I have been saying for the last kind of 5 years around this conversation, which is we don't yet have the conversation to have this conversation properly. We don't have the language yet, because when you've got different parts of science saying the opposing things, like psychology saying one thing and physiology saying the opposite about sex and gender, how do we move forward? But I guess I sit here now and go, how do we pass legislation when we haven't actually nailed that down quite yet either? But I guess time will tell. What
and in some ways you kind of have to force the issue sometimes by passing legislation, you know, you know, because otherwise you just kind of get stuck in this endless loop of, well, what about this, what about that? And you know, you've got a community of people who actually we need to do something for, so why don't we just kind of crack on with it, and you know, allow ourselves to evolve over time.
All right, listen, we kind of got diverted there. That's what we do here, though. Let's finish off your fun things for 2022. Winter Olympics and Commonwealth Games. Valerie Adams, that's supposed to be Valerie Adams. Is she going to be back again, you think, winning more gold? Hope so.
Oh, yeah, I hope so too. I wouldn't see why not.
India heading off to space without a single tax-dodging billionaire on board. Yeah, that's come from the Greens. Brand new public. Yeah, look, I'm very excited about Matariki, June 24th, brand new public holiday with a weekendized. Is that what they call it? Monday eyes, eh? Monday eyes.
Yeah,
we get a
horrible
day
word, but that's what it says on the tin.
The next one should be Dominion Day. I think there's one in Dominion Day, which is a nice.
Except the thing about Matariki, it is the only Indigenous public holiday. So it's something that I'm really proud of, and I'm really delighted that it's happening.
Yeah, no, I'm down. I mean, and I mean, like, even if I wasn't down for Matariki being a national holiday and stuff, and another day off, who's not going to be up for that? And your plan to reduce climate pollution comes into effect. Bolsonaro thrown out of Brazil, we hope, in October. More support for people who need it, benefit increases, and increased support for mental health services. Māori Health Authority and Ministry for Disability set up, fingers crossed, for an excellent 2022, which I think is a nice place to leave. James Shaw, the co-leader of the Greens. Hey, thanks for joining us today. Look, I know that we do a bit of a crazy thing here, and we sometimes sort of float around with topics and we get distracted and we go off on tangents, but it's sort of what we do, and I'm really appreciative that you gave us an hour today to have a chat about things. Have a great Christmas. Have you got anything planned for Christmas Day yourself? What does it look like for you?
Well, I'm actually hoping to read John le Carré's new novel, which, given that he's dead, is certainly his last one. But I just think that's a great kind of summer read, just to take my brain somewhere else than kind of climate change proposals. Yeah,
very good. And then you basically come into an 18-month run up to the next election. Is that right? Pretty much.
Yeah, pretty much. So, I mean, I obviously have no insight into when the next election will be, except that it will be in the second half of 2023 sometime. So, it does sort of start to focus the mind somewhat.
And hopefully the skeleton staff won't get called into Parliament through the summer period for any COVID crisis. That's what we're all hoping for.
Yeah, when you talk about skeleton staff responding to a virus pandemic, it does sort of raise kind of, Evil Dead sort of images in your mind. So let's hope it's not that kind of Christmas.
All right, Climate Change Minister, co-leader of the Green Party, James Shaw. James, thanks so much for joining us today. Really do appreciate your time.
Thanks very much for having me on the show.